This is the moment the Middle East stopped playing by Washington's rules. Right now, if you look at the airspace over Lebanon, you will not see the calm that the ceasefire agreements promised. You will see something that military analysts in Tel Aviv and Washington have privately been dreading for months. Russian military aircraft, Su-34 strike jets bearing the emblem of a country that was supposed to be too broken, too distracted, and too bogged down in Ukraine to project power anywhere else, have entered Lebanese airspace. And they did not ask for permission from Israel. They did not notify the United States. They simply appeared. As of 7:22 a.m. Eastern Time, Friday, April 24, 2026, the geopolitical map of the Middle East has just been redrawn in the most public, most deliberate, and most humiliating way possible for two of the most powerful military establishments on Earth. Vladimir Putin, a man the Western press has spent 2 years calling isolated, weakened, and strategically cornered, just sent his warplanes into a country that Israel considers its own operational backyard. And he did it on the same morning that Washington was still celebrating what it called a decisive week of strikes against Iranian targets. Benjamin Netanyahu, already facing a fractured war cabinet, already under pressure from a population exhausted by 3 years of conflict on multiple fronts, already watching his relationship with the Trump administration fray over the terms of a potential Gaza settlement, has just been handed the single most destabilizing development of his current term. Not from Iran, not from Hezbollah, from Moscow. In this breakdown, we are going to follow every piece of this. How Putin rebuilt his military footprint in the eastern Mediterranean while everyone was watching Ukraine. How Russia turned the collapse of Assad into a strategic repositioning. How Washington missed every warning sign that Moscow was moving back onto the board. And what it means for Israel, for Lebanon, for the ceasefire, and for every American soldier and diplomat currently operating in a region that just got significantly more dangerous. Putin is not losing his grip on the Middle East. He just showed the world exactly where he put it. 2 years ago, Vladimir Putin was supposed to be finished in the Middle East. The plan, as Western capitals understood it, was straightforward. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 had consumed Moscow's military budget, drained its most capable personnel, and forced it to redirect every available resource toward a land war it was struggling to win. The fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in December 2024 was supposed to be the final blow. Russia's most important ally in the Arab world, the anchor of its entire Mediterranean strategy, collapsed in a matter of days. The Humiliates air base in Latakia, Russia's crown jewel in the region, was suddenly operating in a country no longer governed by Moscow's client. The Tartus naval base, Russia's only warm water port with Mediterranean access, was on borrowed time. Washington breathed easy. Israel breathed easy. The dominant analysis, published in think tanks from London to Tel Aviv, was that Russia in the Middle East had become what analysts were politely calling a secondary actor. A shadow of what it was in 2017, when Russian jets owned Syrian airspace and Putin sat at the head of every table where the region's future was being discussed. But the cost of that assumption was never just analytical, it was strategic. Because while Washington was focused on Iran's nuclear program and Israel was conducting strikes across a dozen fronts, something quiet and methodical was happening in Latakia. Russia was not retreating. Russia was recalibrating. Putin gambled that the new Syrian government, dependent on Turkish backing, economically shattered, and desperate for international legitimacy, would rather have Russia as a tenant than as an enemy. He gambled that Israel, privately terrified of a Turkish military expansion into southern Syria, would prefer a Russian buffer to no buffer at all. He gambled that Washington, consumed by its confrontation with Iran and its complicated relationship with Netanyahu, would not prioritize pushing Russia out of a base it had held for a decade. He assumed every Western capital was looking somewhere else. He assumed correctly. At 5:47 a.m. local time on a Wednesday in April 2026, radar systems operated by the Lebanese armed forces and monitored jointly by UNIFIL observers registered something that had not appeared in Lebanese airspace in any confirmed official capacity in years. 2 Russian Su-34 strike aircraft, flying from the direction of the Syrian coast, crossed into Lebanese airspace from the northeast. They flew low. They flew slow enough to be seen. They did not jam communications. They did not conduct any strike. They simply flew in full visibility of every radar system in the region, and then they landed at a location that 3 separate intelligence sources have described as a forward staging point in the Bekaa Valley. For 11 minutes, there was nothing on any official channel. No statement from Moscow. No statement from Beirut. No scramble from the Israeli Air Force, which has conducted hundreds of operations in Lebanese airspace over the past 2 years and has never once been told it needed permission to be there. Pause. Then, at 6:03 a.m., a single line appeared on the Russian Ministry of Defense's official channel. Routine training mission, Eastern Mediterranean theater. No coordinates, no timeline, no explanation for why a routine training mission required landing inside Lebanon rather than returning to Hammeim. While that terse statement was being parsed by analysts in Tel Aviv, something else was also happening. Inside the Israeli Prime Minister's office, an emergency call had already been placed to Washington at 6:09 a.m. The call went to the National Security Council duty officer, not to the Secretary of State, not to the Defense Secretary directly, which tells you something about how the initial assessment was being managed. The message from Jerusalem was described by one person, familiar with its contents, as urgent, but not yet categorized as a military trigger. Israel wanted clarification. Israel wanted to know if Washington had been informed in advance. Israel wanted to know if this was part of some back-channel arrangement between Trump and Putin that had not been shared with its closest ally in the region. Washington's answer, according to the same source, was the one answer that made everything worse. Washington had not been informed. Washington was finding out at the same time as everyone else. While Israel was processing the shock of an uninvited Russian military presence in Lebanese airspace, something else was also happening in Moscow. Putin was sitting for a scheduled interview with Russian state television, an interview that had been arranged 3 weeks in advance, in which he was asked about Russia's role in the Middle East. His answer, delivered with the flat, unhurried cadence of a man who had been waiting for this moment, was brief. Russia, he said, has responsibilities in the region that predate the current conflict. Russia, he said, is present where it is needed. When asked whether he had informed Israel or the United States before the operation, he paused. He almost smiled. "We inform those we have agreements with," he said. "We have no agreement requiring us to inform anyone about training operations." Defense futures in 3 European markets moved within the hour. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange opened down 2.3%. The price of Brent crude jumped 4.7% in a single trading session as markets began pricing in the possibility of a new, unpredictable actor with basing rights in Lebanon. According to sources familiar with internal discussions at the Israeli Ministry of Defense, the mood in the hours after the Russian aircraft were confirmed on the ground in Lebanon was not the controlled, analytical calm that Israeli military culture projects in public. It was something closer to fury. A senior defense official, speaking to a small group of military correspondents under strict anonymity conditions, described the scene in the war room as one of the most tense internal moments since the early days of the Gaza operation in 2023. The specific source of fury was not the Russian presence itself, which Israeli intelligence had been tracking as a growing possibility for weeks. The fury was directed at something else entirely. At the deconfliction mechanism. Since 2015, Israel and Russia have maintained what both sides call a deconfliction arrangement, a system of back-channel military communications designed to ensure that Israeli operations in Syria and Lebanon do not accidentally intersect with Russian operations in the same airspace. This arrangement had been Israel's insurance policy. It was the reason Israel could conduct hundreds of strikes on Iranian positions in Syria without triggering a confrontation with Moscow. It was the reason Netanyahu had met with Putin 7 times and always left the room saying relations were excellent. What the Russian aircraft landing in Lebanon revealed was that the deconfliction mechanism only works when Russia chooses to use it. And Russia, on this morning, had chosen not to. A private call took place between a senior official in the Netanyahu government and the Russian ambassador to Israel at 8:30 a.m. The conversation, described by a source briefed on its content, lasted exactly 19 minutes. The Israeli side demanded an explanation. The Russian side offered none that was satisfying. The ambassador read from prepared remarks. The operation was legal. Lebanon had not formally objected. The aircraft had violated no international agreement. The deconfliction mechanism, he noted carefully, applies to Syria, not to Lebanon. That single sentence was what stopped the room cold. One advisor present, quoted in notes from the session, said what everyone in the room was already thinking. They spent 9 years building a mechanism we trusted, and they just told us the mechanism has a border we never noticed. Why did Putin do this? Follow the timing, because timing is everything in a move this calculated. Russia landed those aircraft in Lebanon on the same morning that the United States and Israel were still absorbing the international reaction to their joint strikes on Iranian military infrastructure, strikes that had been condemned by China, criticized by Turkey, and quietly cheered by exactly nobody in the Arab world who was willing to say so publicly. Putin chose the moment of maximum Western self-congratulation to make a move that cost him nothing militarily and bought him everything symbolically. This is the power shift that analysts have been reluctant to say out loud. Russia is no longer trying to match American or Israeli military capability in the Middle East. It doesn't need to. It only needs to demonstrate presence, because presence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is the currency that buys leverage at every negotiating table. What Putin cannot do anymore, at least not at full scale, is sustain a prolonged air campaign. Russia's military has been ground down by Ukraine. Its best pilots, its most advanced systems, its deep logistics chains are all committed to a front that is not the Mediterranean. But Putin understands something that Washington keeps forgetting. You do not need to be able to win a war in a region to hold a seat at the table where the region's future is decided. You only need to be able to disrupt the plans of people who think they are winning. By basing Russian aircraft in Lebanon, even temporarily, even under the fiction of a training mission, Putin has done three things simultaneously. He has reminded Israel that the deconfliction mechanism is a courtesy, not a guarantee. He has reminded Washington that any new security architecture in Lebanon that does not include Russia as a participant will be an architecture with a significant gap in it. And he has reminded every actor in the region that the man who is supposed to be marginalized still has the ability to appear in your airspace on a Tuesday morning without asking anyone's permission. The legal exposure for the existing ceasefire framework is serious. UNIFIL commanders have already filed a formal incident report. 2 members of the UN Security Council have privately requested clarification from Moscow. And the legal question of whether the terms of the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire, which restrict the movement of armed forces in specific zones of southern Lebanon, apply to a country that was not a party to the agreement, is now sitting in the office of the UN Secretary General's legal team without a clean answer. You cannot deter a country that has nothing left to lose in the room you're fighting in. Here is the domino effect that is now running in real time, and none of these dominoes fall quietly. If Russia has established even a temporary basing arrangement inside Lebanon, then Israel's operational freedom in Lebanese airspace, freedom it has exercised for years without a single formal challenge, is now conditional in a way it has never been before. If that freedom is conditional, then the hundreds of strike operations Israel conducts against Hezbollah weapons infrastructure, against Iranian transfer routes, against targets throughout the Bekaa Valley, all become geometrically more complicated. If those operations become complicated, the military pressure on Hezbollah that has been the central pillar of the ceasefire's enforcement weakens. And if the enforcement weakens, the ceasefire itself is not far behind. Beijing is watching this with a level of interest that goes well beyond academic. China has been deepening its economic engagement with Lebanon and its diplomatic relationships across the Levant throughout 2025 and 2026. A Russia that can project air power into Lebanese territory, even in the minimal form of a landing and a statement, is a Russia that serves as a proof of concept for the proposition that the American-Israeli security architecture in the Middle East is not as airtight as Washington claims. That is a message Beijing will use in every conversation it has with Gulf states that are currently being asked to choose sides. And where is the American response? Where is the military statement from CENTCOM? Where is the diplomatic message from the State Department to Moscow, laying out the consequences of establishing basing rights inside a country that sits at the center of the most fragile ceasefire in the region? Silence. 22 hours after the Russian aircraft landed, the official American response has been a single State Department spokesperson sentence describing the situation as something Washington is monitoring closely. Monitoring closely is not a deterrent. It is an invitation. This creates a fracture inside the relationship between Washington and Jerusalem that has been widening for months and just cracked open in full public view. On one side, the Trump administration, which has been cultivating a working relationship with Putin on Ukraine and is not inclined to create a new confrontation over an airspace incident in a country it has been trying to reduce its footprint in. On the other side, Israel, which does not have the luxury of managing its security concerns on a diplomatic timetable and which now faces the possibility that its most reliable airspace advantage has been quietly undermined by a country it thought it had an understanding with. A divided partnership between Washington and Jerusalem cannot enforce a ceasefire, cannot contain Hezbollah's rearmament, and cannot present a unified deterrent to a Russia that has just proved it can move freely in the spaces that partnership left unguarded. Reports from people close to the situation describe a Netanyahu government that is genuinely, deeply rattled, not performing concern for domestic consumption, actually rattled. The Prime Minister has reportedly asked his security chiefs the same question in 3 separate sessions since the aircraft landed. Did we know this was possible? The answer, according to sources in the room, has been uncomfortable. They knew Russia was rebuilding in Latakia. They did not know Lebanon had been factored into the new footprint. They should have. They are a message written in aviation fuel and delivered at dawn without a phone call or a courtesy notice or a single word of warning to the two countries that have spent the better part of a decade believing they were the only ones who got to decide what flew over Lebanon. Those aircraft represent something that Western strategists keep writing off because it is uncomfortable to write in. The proof that Russia's decline in the Middle East was always going to be temporary because Russia's goals in the region have always been permanent. Putin wanted a seat at every table where this region's future was being decided. He built one in Syria. He lost it when Assad fell. And instead of accepting the loss, he found a new surface to put the seat on. That surface is Lebanon. That surface is the gap in an Israeli-American security architecture that was designed to manage Iran and forgot to account for a Russia that was watching, waiting, and reading every blind spot with the patience of a government that does not have to answer to an election cycle in the way its adversaries do. You can strike Iranian targets. You can dismantle Hezbollah's missile stockpiles. You can negotiate ceasefire terms and enforce buffer zones and build security frameworks that satisfy every clause of international law. But you cannot do any of it if a country with a permanent UN Security Council seat and a functioning air force decides it wants to be present in the same theater and chooses a morning when you are distracted to prove it. So where are we right now? Russian aircraft are on the ground in Lebanon. The deconfliction mechanism between Moscow and Jerusalem is effectively suspended, or at least its scope has been revealed to be far narrower than Israel believed. Washington is monitoring. UNIFIL has filed a report. The ceasefire is intact on paper and wobbling in practice. And Vladimir Putin, the man who was supposed to be finished, is sitting in Moscow watching every reaction with the calm of someone who has already calculated 3 moves further than the people reacting to his last one. Expect escalation in the language before there is any escalation in the actions. Israel will make statements. Netanyahu will convene security consultations. There will be a phone call between Jerusalem and Washington that gets described as productive and resolves nothing. Putin will say nothing further that adds clarity, because clarity is the one thing he has no interest in providing. He might allow Russia's aircraft to complete their stated training mission and withdraw, pocketing the symbolic victory while giving everyone an off-ramp. He might extend the mission, testing whether Israel will act against Russian aircraft the way it acts against Iranian proxies, knowing the answer is almost certainly no. He could even use this moment to propose a formal role for Russia in the next phase of ceasefire monitoring, positioning himself as a necessary participant in the very architecture that his move just destabilized. But what cannot be undone is the image. Russian warplanes in Lebanese airspace, on the ground, on the same morning that Washington was congratulating itself on a successful week of strikes. The deconfliction agreement, the quiet understanding that Russia stays in its lane and Israel stays in its lane and nobody tests the other's boundaries, is no longer the safe assumption it was 24 hours ago. Subscribe and stay with this story. The next 72 hours will determine whether this is a one-time signal or the opening move of a permanent Russian repositioning in Lebanon. If Moscow announces any formalization of basing rights, or if Israel takes any military action in response, we will cover it the moment it breaks. This is not an isolated incident. This is the beginning of a completely new chapter in the Middle East. And the people most responsible for the chapter that just ended were the ones who decided Russia was no longer worth watching. Watch the skies and watch Moscow.